Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Office of the State Controller's Quick Vids training series. These videos are designed to help state agencies record and verify various accounting requirements within RSTARS based on guidance from the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. I'll be walking you through the lease termination fact pattern for the example transactions we'll be posting into RSTARS. For our initial example lease, we had a term of 5 years or 60 monthly payments. There is a monthly payment of $20,000 and an interest rate of 4%. We entered this information into the T-Value software, and you can see the results in the amortization schedule down below. It gave us a present value of minimum future lease payments of $1,086,370.61. Moving to our example for lease termination, we learned that our lease was terminated early, effective June 2nd, 2025. Initially, for a termination as seen in steps 11 of the entries, the current portion of the lease liability should be reclassed back into the non-current portion. We understand that this current portion is usually not updated until month 13, and so it likely remains as it did at the end of the year in the previous year. Therefore, in hopes of relatability, we will use the $202,150.35. Furthermore, we have a monthly amortization of $18,106.18. This brings us to a total annual amortization of $72,424.71 for fiscal year 24 and $199,167.98 for fiscal year 25, or $271,592.69 of total amortization at the date of termination. Subtracting the $271,592.69 from the commencement amount of $1,086,370.61 gives us an excess asset value of $814,777.92. Finally, we have a lease balance at termination of $834,305.12 as seen on the right side of the amortization schedule. The difference between the excess asset value and the lease balance at termination is a net gain of $19,527.20. In the next few videos, we will walk you through the journal entries and how to enter them into RSTARS.
I will be entering a total of 6 transactions to terminate this lease. I have already mapped out my entries with the document numbers, T-codes, and accounting elements I will need to use. This information is shown at the top of the screen. Make sure you are logged into RSTARS under the correct user class to make the entry. For this entry to terminate a lease for leased equipment, I will be using user class 27. Navigate to the 500 screen to enter the batch header. On the 500 screen, enter your agency number. For this example, I am using agency 107. Enter a batch date or leave the field blank. I am leaving the field blank so it will default to the current date. Enter the batch type. I will be using batch type 4 for this entry. Follow your agency procedures to assign a batch number. I will be using batch number 876 for this example. You may enter the expected batch count and batch amount, or you can leave these fields blank. The batch edit mode will default to edit mode 2. You may enter a batch header effective date, or you can leave this field blank and allow it to default to the current date. If everything looks correct with your batch header, Press F10 to move to the transaction entry screen. All of the entries I will be making to terminate this lease will be within the government-wide reporting fund. My first entry will remove any current portion of the lease liability recorded in GL 1281 related to the lease that is being terminated. For this example, we are assuming that this lease already has a balance in GL 1281 that needs to be cleared in order to terminate this lease. Enter the effective date to determine which fiscal month the transaction should post. This transaction populated with 7/30/24. I'm going to leave that effective date to allow this transaction to post in July. Enter the document number and suffix. This is a JV document. I will input that information on the entry, suffix 001. Enter the T code. I will be using T code 475R. Since it's an R entry, I will enter an R in the reverse field. Enter your PCA. There is no agency object required for this specific T code. If you're unsure what elements may be required for a specific T code, you can look that up on the 28A screen by T code. Enter the amount for the transaction, $202,150.35. Enter the document amount. The document amount for this is going to be 0. This entry is going to net with the next entry that I enter to 0. So I will put a document amount of 0. We'll enter in the description. And this T code also requires that a GL be entered with it. I will enter this GL at the bottom of the transaction entry screen. We will be using 1281 for this entry. If everything looks correct, you may press F4 to bring in any lookup fields. This brings in the associated fund, and press F10 to save the transaction. My second entry will reclass the outstanding current portion of the lease liability to GL 1716. Because the lease termination entries are going to be made using GL 1716, I want to ensure the entire outstanding lease obligation for the lease is recorded in GL 1716 before I make the remaining entries to terminate this lease. The current document number carried forward from my last entry and the suffix incremented to 002. So I will go through and update any information that needs to be updated for the second transaction. The T code will remain the same, 475. This is not an R, so we do not need to put anything in the reverse field. The PCA will remain the same. The document amount will be the same. I will need to input that information. Another thing that we'll need to change is the GL account. We are moving the balance from 1281 to GL 1716. So I want this entry to use 1716. If everything looks good with your entry, you may press F10 to save the transaction. My third entry is to eliminate the excess asset value of the lease and record any associated gain or loss. Please note that the amount for this T code 537 entry is the excess leased asset value. It does not include any portion that was previously amortized. For this entry, I will enter a brand new JV document number. In this case, JV 870206, and I will do suffix 001 for this new transaction. You could also choose to make these entries in a separate batch or use a similar document number as JV 870106-003. There's a few different options here. To make it a little bit easier to calculate the document amount, I've chosen to do a separate document number for this entry. I will update any information that needs to be updated for my third entry. This will be a T code 537. The PCA will remain 04004, but I will need to enter an agency object on this transaction. Input the amount. And this T code also requires a GL be entered. In this case, we will be doing 0821 for leased equipment. Once all the information has been updated and looks correct, press F10 to save. My fourth entry in this batch will remove any accumulated amortization for this lease. For leased equipment, any associated amortization would be recorded in GL 0886. Depending on the type of leased asset, this may vary. I will update this to a BT document. T code 573 and 574 will net to 0, and they are processed on a BT or balance transfer document. I'll update my information for this BT. I will update the T code to 573. The PCA will remain the same. This T code does not require objects, so I will remove that from the entry. I will enter the associated amount, and I will update the GL, in this case 0886. Press F10 to save the transaction. For my fifth entry, I will be removing the asset value for this lease. This entry will balance with T code 573, so it will use the same dollar amount. The document number is the same. It's already incremented the suffix. I will update the T code. I will input the amount. And I will update the GL, in this case 0821, for leased equipment. If everything looks good with my entry, I will press F10 to save. My final entry for this lease termination batch will clear the lease obligation in GL 1716 related to this lease. This will use a new JV document number. I will update that information on my transaction, update it to suffix 01. This is a T code 462R, so I will enter an R in the reverse field. This also requires an object, 2331. We'll enter the amount. This is the lease balance at termination that I'm using for this entry. And I will need to update my GL to 1716 to clear any lease obligation related to this lease being terminated. I can press F4 if I want to see what fields are going to be looked up. It inputs the comp object that's associated with this agency object. If your agency doesn't use agency objects, if your agency only records with comp objects, you may not enter this. Your agency may also have specific fields that are used, optional accounting elements such as index, grant number, project number. So make sure you're looking at what coding is needed for your agency when preparing your batch. If everything looks correct, I can press F10 to save this transaction. This completes my lease termination entries. I can press F7, details, to see all of the lines of entry, my 6 lines here with all of the amounts. From here, I can press F6 balancing to make sure my batch is in balance. I have a warning. Document JV870206 is not in balance. What this means is I did not enter the correct document amount for my entry on JV870206. So in order to bring this batch in balance so we can release it, I will go back to the details screen and I will make an update to the transaction that has an error. I'll select the suffix or the sequence 0003, that's the document number that came up with the error on the batch balancing screen, and press F11 to correct the batch. The recall a batch for correction screen will come up. I will press F4 change, and I can see the document amount is listed as 0, which is not correct for this document. It should be the 814,77792. So I will clear this information out, enter the corrected information, press F10 to save the transaction. And I will scroll through with F5 just to make sure there's no other problems with the document amounts. The system will stop at the first document that has an error. So my BT document, I have 0. That's correct. That's what it should be. Same for the second sequence or suffix, 002 is 0. And now the third one, I also have an error. If I didn't see this and I went back to the balancing screen, I'd get a message that this document was not in balance as well. So since we're here, I will update this document amount as well. So it should be 834,305.12. Press F10 to save. I can press F7 and see, here's my lines of entry. Let's go back to the F6 balancing screen. And I have JV870306 not in balance. So let's take another look at this document. Press F11. Press F4 to change. And the issue is, this is an R. This needs to be a negative document amount because we are using a 462R. So I will update this to show a negative document amount. I will press F10, and then I will go back to the balancing screen and see my batch is now balanced. This completes my entries. This batch is now ready for review and release.
We have generated the DAFR 6610 and 6620 reports to verify the information was recorded properly. The examples used in these videos were created within the acceptance region. Since OB does not include the acceptance region, we ordered the DAFR 6610 and 6620 reports. But under normal circumstances, the DAFR 6610 and 6620 reports within the OB repository will show the same information. These reports are used by your SARS analyst in conjunction with agency disclosures to evaluate if balances and activities are recorded correctly for proper reporting in the ACFR. Therefore, it's important to review either these DAFR reports or OB queries regularly and during the year-end closing process. Scrolling through the reports briefly, we can verify the information. In the previous portion of our training, we walked you through terminating a lease within RSTARD. We can see it here on the DAFR 6610 for the Government-Wide Reporting Fund, an agency object 2331, with a net gain on disposal of $19,527.20. This is appropriate. Turning to the DAFR 6620, we will also see changes in GL accounts 0821, 0886, 1281, and 1716. As you've likely noticed on this report and the DAFR 6610, there are lease balances remaining despite the termination we've just completed. This is due to the agency having multiple leases recorded and not only the one that we terminated. Therefore, the balances in GL 0821 and 0886 should agree to your lease documentation for the active leases. Finally, we would expect a balance in GL 1281 for the current portion of lease obligations, since there are multiple leases, but as you can see, it's a zero balance. That was simply because this video was recorded after the lease modification quick vid, and as part of that, there were no current portion entries posted. These balances are appropriate. These transactions have been recorded correctly.